that's a big part of stuff, then you should ask yourself what you're doing in graduate school, right? Uh, a lot of people love particular jobs and are motivated actually by being given freedom to pursue whatever they want to pursue because they have a lot of desire to achieve great things in that area. Another really powerful incentive, but one totally neglected in economics, I think, is reciprocity within a group, family ties, altruism, or forming a sense of a team. So if you look at the military, almost all incentives in the military are given that way. If you ask most, I don't know if any of you guys know someone who served in the military, but they'll tell you the reason that they fight on the battlefield has nothing to do with America. It has to do with the fact that they love the people that they're with. But why do they love the people that they were with? Because they were thrown into a group with this small group, and then they were made to do all sorts of incredibly intense and scary things with those people. And that formed a really close sense of bonding. And the first lesson of military discipline is that the reason that you discipline people really is not to get them to obey their superiors. It's to get them to all feel a little bit of resentment against their superiors together, because that makes them feel close to each other, and then they'll be willing to die for each other, right? So the reason that so many of the things in the military are set up the way they are is to form this sense of cohesion within units. And so I think that, again, economists love to talk about the stuff that's up here and don't like to talk about the stuff that's down here. But what we see is that this stuff shows up all over the place in markets. So if we believe markets work well, we should pay more attention to this stuff, I think. Yeah, go ahead. What's your name again?
David.
David, yeah.
So what about yardstick competition where you take the performance of somebody else and use that to
Yeah, I view that as sort of being like a bonus based on hard information in some sense, but yeah, like a form of that. But that's good. Okay, so those are incentive schemes, and let me try to talk about some of the incentive problems that these schemes try to solve. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So do you think the soft things are ignored because they're just hard to measure, or do you think it's because they kind of fall outside of the standard, the normal utility function that gets?
I'll leave you guys to judge that, but I think probably more of the latter than the former, in my personal opinion. But I, in general, think these sort of quote-unquote non-material things are very neglected in economics. So here are some of the problems that these incentives try to solve. So embezzlement. Now, embezzlement may sound like, oh, haha, that happens every so often with a big corporation, whatever. But it's actually much more common than you think. This is the main reason why there's security cameras in stores. It's actually not to look at people shoplifting. It's to look at the people who work there who might be stealing from the store. And a lot of bookkeeping is really about making sure people aren't stealing from companies. And this is a huge problem in developing countries. It's one of the reasons why so many things in developing countries are sold in these little carts rather than in stores, because no one can trust employees not to steal from the store. Shirking is another thing. So the simplest example of that is just not working at all, but also just not focusing enough on your work, not being prepared, doing work to prepare outside work for work. A third issue is excessive or insufficient risk-taking. So this was obviously a huge problem with the Wall Street banks during the financial crisis. And it happens often because employees get the upside but not the downside of the risk that they face. So a great example of this was this guy who was at BNP Paribas, I don't know if you guys heard about this, who took these enormous risks. Because he sort of knew that if he did incredibly well, everyone would forget that he was doing something he wasn't authorized to do and he'd get promoted. And if he didn't do so well, he'd be kicked out, but how bad would that be, right? On the other hand, in some cases, when workers, say, are getting paid a lot, they may be really scared about losing their job and not take on enough risks. That, I think, some people might think happens during the tenure process, that people don't take on ambitious enough projects because the chances of paying out are not high enough. Okay. And that happens a lot when people have choices over how ambitious the projects the firm undertakes should be. Short-termism is a similar, very closely related issue. So other less traditional incentive issues have been popular to think about in economics recently. So one of these is called empire building, which is that many managers may, to impress a member of the opposite gender or to achieve a great career afterwards, may be interested in seeking glory or fame or something like that rather than the actual profits of the shareholders. And therefore they may try to expand business in flashy or inefficient ways. So recent studies have shown that a lot of mergers are actually like this, that they're not really driven because they'll actually be beneficial to the firms, but just in order to make the manager show up in the newspapers and so forth. Incentives that work well against this, I think, well, does anyone want to try to say what incentives they think would work well and poorly against this? Yeah, go ahead.
Ownership of the company itself. I mean, if you profiting from the
Yeah.
profits of the company, you would not engage in such activities.
Yeah, what's your name?
Aman.
Aman?
Yeah, I'm still not registered.
Okay. So, yeah, that's right. And I mean, sort of any material incentive will work pretty well against this stuff. What works really badly, actually, is a lot of those non-material incentives. So a lot of this stuff about, reputation or, sense of professionalism will actually lead you to be like, yes, I believe in the mission of this company. I'm going to build this giant thing, and I'm going to way overexpand, even if it isn't in the interest of the shareholders. On the other hand, an opposite case to that is that there are some outcomes that are really easy to measure and other outcomes that are not so easy to measure. So for example, the sales made by a worker may be easy to measure, but how well he treated or didn't treat or defrauded the people he sold the stuff to might not be observable. And employees need to manage these. Sorry, what's your name?
Neil.
Neil.
Not
Yeah.
well. The Empire Building, could it be
Yeah.
that they're actually rational in their decision, and they're because they're hoping that by growing that big they could exploit inefficiencies in the market?
Well, maybe, but I think that's what these studies indicate is not the case with a lot of these mergers. That, in fact, they end up losing money a lot. I mean, there's all sorts of empirical issues about whether you believe those studies or not, but that's what they seem to indicate.
Do you have an example for inefficient mergers?
Well, I mean, according to these studies, and again, you don't have to believe them, but the majority of mergers are inefficient. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the most classic example. But Stig, yeah?
There's actually been a lot of recent large companies that have broken up into multiple companies, and
Yeah.
the collective value of the shares has gone way up.
Yeah.
A lot of times by 200%.
Yeah. So that's often spin-offs are forced by the outside, by someone who comes in, takes it over, and then spins some stuff off, and then they end up doing better. So that's a good example, Stig. Yeah. So my favorite example of the multitasking problem is that in Colombia, they paid people to kill gorillas, and they had a hard time verifying whether someone was actually a gorilla or not. And so there were a lot of just innocent villagers who came back in body bags, dressed up as gorillas. And the U.S. Army took the great example of that happening in in Colombia and decided to do this in Afghanistan. And that didn't work so well and didn't make us so popular in Afghanistan. What incentives do you think would work best on this sort of problem, and which would work worst? Anyone? Well, so this is sort of almost the reverse of empire building, right? So the non-material incentives, that sense of decency, sense of dignity, sense of what your professional responsibilities are, work well to offset the bad incentives to only do the things that can be seen. On the other hand, the material incentives tend to work really badly because they're all based on the observables, right? Another issue is overstaying your welcome. So managers like to stay in control for their reputation, to keep their job, etc., even when it would be better to let someone who's better suited to this particular role take over. And to do that, they often try to make themselves invaluable. So they try to make it really complicated to figure out what's going on in the company, so no one else can come and take over their position, so that no one can fire them, right? And something that works really well against that is golden parachutes, which are much maligned That's like, that you get money, you get a great severance package, right? One reason that companies do that is otherwise managers will have too much incentive to try to make it look like they can't possibly be replaced, right? Yeah, James.
Do golden parachutes reduce empire building?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's another thing that they can be used to justify.
You can lodge yourself in a company and a thought it's better
Yeah.
if you've got more
Yeah, I think that that's right. Okay. And when companies are financed, many of these issues arise. So one of the old problem sets that you can look at asks about these things, but let's think through some of them ourselves. So personal capital. If I can, fund a company myself, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of that, Prashank?
Your incentives are aligned with sort of the actual company,
Yeah.
but you might not have like enough capital to expand beyond the capacity of your capital and actually do more.
Yeah.
Take on more risk and
That's-
actually create value.
Yeah, and also you take a lot of risk with your own money, right? So friends and family financing is sort of the next stage beyond that, right? That's where you get money from friends or family, not just your own personal capital. And Chrissy, what do you think are some of the advantages and disadvantages of that?
Well, I think there's the similar problem with still bearing a lot of the risk.
Yeah.
Especially if the utility of your family members is
Yeah.
part of your utility.
Yeah.
But they could also make you become more risk averse because you have pressures that aren't necessarily measurable.
Yeah.
In your business behavior.
That's right, and also, but what about the advantages?
Well, the advantages are that you don't have to go through like loan checks. You can just go to your relatives or your
Yeah.
friends and ask for the collateral.
And also you'll work in their interests probably harder, maybe even harder than you would if it was personal capital sometimes, because you care a lot about them.
It's also cheaper, right? Like they don't charge interest.
Yeah, exactly.
For some things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and if you ever need, if you ever want to start a business, you should just borrow from your parents, right? That's according to Governor Romney, right?
The interest taking care of them at old age.
No, I'm not very sympathetic to his position on that issue. Venture capital is often the next level for a startup company. And these usually have some dedicated, experts who really know the industry and can, judge the company pretty well. And they often actually replace the manager of the company when they're brought in. So, Eric, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of?
I mean, like you said before, there's like the principal agent problem, right, with the investors
Mhm.
who just want to make a profit
Yep.
versus like possibly long-term like goals that the company might want to work towards, but
Mhm.
the investors just want to have like a short-term profit.
Yeah.
Um,
And what are some of the advantages of venture capital?
Obviously, there's a much bigger like pool of money that you can get your hands in.
Yeah.
And it's possible that some of the venture capitalists would be much more willing to take risks
Mhm.
that you wouldn't be willing to take with your own personal.
Yeah. And on the other hand, versus more public forms of financing, venture capitalists often have a lot of specialized knowledge and are able to monitor the guy a lot better than public equity markets could. How about debt? What are some of the ups and downs of debt? Is Zemo Lee here? No?
I think he's dropping the class.
Okay. Does anyone want to talk about some of the benefits and costs of debt? Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Well, it's good for tax reasons, and it's good because it like provides managers motivation to continue to
Mhm.
perform. It's bad because if you have too much of it, the managers lose their equity incentive,
Mhm.
or like equity holders lose incentive.
Yeah, I mean, I think one big disadvantage is that people can take a lot of risk because they don't face the downside because that just screws the debt holders, and on the upside they get a lot of benefits, so they can take a lot of risk often. How about bank versus bond financing? Is Raluca here? No, she's not. Does anyone want to talk about bank versus bond financing, like two different ways of debt? No. So like basically the good